Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at the four-year plan and whether it was a total failure, 1936 to 1939. We're going to argue for the sake of this revision video that the four-year plan wasn't a total failure. Its main success was in achieving probably its most important aim, which was readiness for war. And it achieved that to a fair degree, although it wasn't perfect. However, it is true to say that there were some major failures with the four-year plan, but not a total failure. So unemployment was made to look better than it was. Autarky, well, they certainly didn't achieve self-sufficiency with the four-year plan, even though there was a slight improvement. And living standards actually got considerably worse in this period. So in that way, the four-year plan was not a total success. The best evidence we have that the four-year plan was not a total failure, which is our argument, is Germany's readiness for war in 1939. Now, they weren't perfect. They actually had a name for this. It was called Wehrwirtschaft, and excuse my German pronunciation, which means fighting economy. And they had a fair degree of success. So Goering's four-year plan actually led to brown coal and explosives being produced fairly self-sufficiently by Germany, so they're not actually having to import those goods. They had a number of very successful steel and coal in chemical industries. IG Farben was the most successful chemical industry even. And they were making around about 240 million Reichsmarks of profit a year, just to give you an idea of how much they're producing by 1939. Their increase in production was around about 343% after the start of the four-year plan, so massive increase in production. The Krupp Steelworks is another big business who did really well for themselves because they created lots of steel. There were a number of steel industries who refused to go along with the four-year plan, and Goering's response to that was to basically close them down and create a state-owned steelworks, which he named after himself, the Hermann Goering Steelworks. And by setting up the Hermann Goering Steelworks, then he became really, actually very successful with doing that. It became the largest steel producing manufacturers in Europe, and they expanded into Austria and Poland and France, which was already great for propaganda. And private companies were forced to invest into his steelworks, which obviously helped them to expand their production as well. So in that way, they were really successful. And in terms of how that helped their readiness for war, well, it was significant. Obviously, things like the chemicals that they needed for explosives and iron and steel are absolutely essential for creating weapons and munitions. So Germany had 6 armoured divisions of around 2,400 tanks each by 1939, which was significantly more than France and Britain, which is really impressive when you consider what the state had been after the Treaty of Versailles. Only a few years earlier. And Germany went from producing around just under 2,000 aircrafts a year in 1935, before the four-year plan, to close to 5,000 aircrafts a year by 1939. So again, I mean, they've doubled their output at least, probably a little bit more than that actually, of aircrafts, which helped them to have a really strong Luftwaffe, which obviously was an essential part of the fighting that happened during World War II. Unemployment decreasing, I would say, is less good as evidence of success of the four-year plan, though. So there was some limited success, but a lot of it either was already happening or was really more propaganda than actual change. Unemployment wasn't really the main aim of the four-year plan, and in that way you could argue that it's not really a failure of the four-year plan. Hitler had already said that the battle for work, as he put it, was won by 1936. And officially, statistics that the Nazis had said that there were only 1.6 million unemployed in 1936. In reality, we know that there were far more than that. Racial policy was becoming increasingly more radical around this time. Jews were being sacked from their jobs. The Nuremberg laws were already in place by 1935. And they were being excluded from statistics, as were women as well, and married women were being pushed out of their jobs. So large numbers of people weren't being included in statistics, and we think in reality there were probably around 3 million unemployed in 1936. But there were some things that were positive for employment in this period. Men were being conscripted into the armed forces. Again, that actually happens before the 4-year plan. So again, how much you can say it was as a result of the 4-year plan is limited. But there were 1.4 million men in the armed forces by 1939. And it was part of war readiness. So I would argue that unemployment isn't, decreasing unemployment isn't a total failure in this period, but it's not really a success. So it's less useful for our argument. Achieving autarky, again, you could argue it's not a total failure. It's not a great success either, but it's not a total failure. So autarky, just as a reminder, means self-sufficiency, and it was Germany's attempt to be war ready by not having to over-rely on imports from other countries. One of the key reasons for this aim was that there had been a bit of a crisis, and there was actually at the beginning of this period, 1936 to 39. 1936 was when Schacht had been in charge of the new plan, so 1934 to 1936 he'd been in charge of the new plan, and that had gone quite badly. They'd been left with a lack of raw materials within Germany. They weren't really creating enough, and there were lots of tariffs and things on foreign goods, and they weren't importing as much as they should, and they ended up in a position where they just didn't have enough money for even paying for the imports that they needed. And there's a bit of a crisis. They don't have enough raw materials to create what they need for war, and they don't have enough food. So 1936, when Goerring takes over the economic situation and the 4-year plan becomes his thing, there is a crisis. So achieving autarky, or at least increasing what they are able to produce at home, so in wartime they don't have to worry about what's going to be cut off from them, did have some limited success. It was certainly better than it had been, and in that way it's not a total failure. For example, during the 4-year plan, Goerring, or at least people who worked for him, found ways of creating lots more brown coal and explosives. They weren't entirely successful. They were hoping to find a synthetic or kind of fake version of petrol using mineral oils, and that failed. They weren't able to do that. But they did have some minor successes at becoming slightly more independent in producing things. And you could swing this statistic either way. By 1939, they were still importing 1/3 of raw materials, but you could argue in that way they were self-sufficient for 2/3 of their raw materials. So 66%, nearly 67% of what they were creating was being produced in Germany. So it's not a total failure. They are slightly more self-sufficient than they had been before, but it's certainly not a complete success. One of the major problems, other than the fact that they're still importing goods, was some of the Germany-produced goods were not of as high a quality and actually cost more than before. So many of the, if you remember, the Ruhr is that area just between Germany and France, and there's lots of manufacturers and industries and things there. The Ruhr steel firms didn't actually want to spend their money on developing new steelworks in this period of the 4-year plan, because they felt like the German iron ore that was being created as part of autarky was actually too poor quality to produce the goods that they wanted to. They didn't trust it enough. And in that way, I mean, autarky is obviously failing because they're not able to win over those companies. However, again, you could say that's not a total failure, as we've mentioned already. We know that Goerring found a way around that, and that was basically to close them down and start using state-owned steelworks instead. Now, in terms of living standards, the 4-year plan was a total failure. But then equally, you could argue that having high living standards wasn't really the aim of the 4-year plan. The aim of the 4-year plan was more about self-sufficiency, or at least war readiness as a key goal. So in that way, even though living standards were atrocious, perhaps the 4-year plan in the eyes of the Nazis wasn't a total failure. But it was bad for living standards. we have this idea of guns versus butter, which is more essential, like food items and essentials for ordinary citizens, or guns or production of military goods. Prices rose in this period quite significantly as a result, partly of protective tariffs and of attempts for autarky. The cheap foreign goods were no longer existent in Germany. We know that there were food shortages because there's such a focus on military goods and services and raw materials and things like that, that they're not actually producing enough consumer goods and food. And the Nazis did actually take that into account. So there were some moments where they did actually take funds from war industries and use them to make sure there was enough food to try and prevent unrest. They used a lot of propaganda to emphasise people's duty to their country and that they needed to be willing to sacrifice. And that's kind of like a key theme through lots of propaganda, willingness to sacrifice. And that shows us something about the 4-year plan, that it clearly wasn't meeting the needs of ordinary people's living and working conditions. And that's why it was necessary for them to create that kind of propaganda. Again, propaganda that we see tried to really focus on positive things as well as talking about duty and willingness to sacrifice. They're talking about the people's radios or receivers, which are just radios, the Volkswagen car, or as we know, Volkswagen means the people's vehicle, cruise ship holidays that the KDF were theoretically going to allow you to go on, even though we know that only about 10% of working people ever actually went on those holidays. And all of these sorts of things were trying to suggest and focus on minor improvements in people's living standards. But we know that even that wasn't actually entirely successful, although opposition was quite limited in this period, possibly because of fear and propaganda maybe. The fact that in 1938 they had to put in place severe penalties for absenteeism and kind of slow goes in work and sort of laziness and slackers suggests that actually not all workers were won over by what was going on with the 4-year plan, and living conditions were clearly a significant issue for people. So just as an example, 114 people were arrested at a munitions plant in 1938. That's a plant producing the key thing that the Nazis were wanting at the time, munitions, war readiness. So in that way, they're not entirely successful. So if we come back to our overall question, the 4-year plan was a total failure, 1936 to 1939. How far do we agree? I would completely disagree with this statement. It's not a total failure. There are some significant successes in terms of their war readiness, and autarky wasn't a total failure. It has some limited success. And you could argue that reducing unemployment was not actually the key aim of the 4-year plan, and in that way, therefore, it's not a total failure. Living standards, again, although they aren't great, were not the main focus of the 4-year plan, and in that way, it's not a total failure. I hope this revision session has been useful, and I would highly recommend perhaps having a look at some sources on the 4-year plan from your textbooks, or having a go at a slightly different question about the Nazi war economy, like perhaps including the new plan alongside the 4-year plan, looking at how successful the Nazi economy was generally 1933 to 39, or thinking about the idea of the economic miracle at the beginning of the Nazis taking power, and thinking about things like the autobahns. So best of luck with your revision and with your exams.